Couple reunites in nursing home 70 years after youthful romance. What happens next shocks everyone. In a quiet Florida nursing home, fate orchestrates an astonishing reunion between two long-lost lovers. As Mary and John's paths cross after 7 decades apart, their rekindled connection sets in motion a series of events that will challenge everything they thought they knew about their past, present, and future. Prepare for a journey filled with shocking revelations, heart-wrenching choices, and a twist that will leave you questioning the very nature of love and destiny. The setting Florida sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center, its fading light painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. For most of the residents, it was just another quiet evening in their twilight years. But for 88-year-old Mary Anderson, this ordinary Tuesday was about to become the first page of an extraordinary new chapter in her life. Mary sat in her favorite armchair by the window, her silver hair neatly coiffed, a weathered romance novel resting in her lap. Her gnarled fingers absently traced the cover's embossed letters as her pale blue eyes, still sharp despite the years, gazed out at the meticulously trimmed hedges. To the casual observer, she might have appeared content, even serene. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm of emotions roiled. "Mrs. Anderson?" A gentle voice broke through her reverie. "It's time for your medication." Mary turned to see Jenny, one of the younger nurses, standing in the doorway with a small paper cup and a glass of water. She forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, dear. Thank you." As Mary swallowed the pills that kept her heart beating steadily and her blood pressure in check, she couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment. How had she ended up here, in this place that smelled of disinfectant and lost dreams? It seemed like only yesterday she was a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Anderson?" Jenny asked, noticing the far-off look in Mary's eyes. Mary patted the nurse's hand. "Oh, I'm fine, sweetheart. Just remembering, that's all. Sometimes the memories are all we have left, you know?" Jenny nodded sympathetically, but Mary knew she couldn't truly understand. How could she explain the weight of 7 decades of choices, regrets, and what-ifs? As the nurse left, Mary's thoughts drifted back to a summer long ago. She could almost smell the salt air of the beach, feel the warm sand between her toes, and hear the carefree laughter of her 18-year-old self. And John, oh John, with his sun-kissed curls and mischievous grin. For a moment, the ache of lost love squeezed her heart so tightly she could hardly breathe. A commotion in the hallway snapped Mary back to the present. Raised voices and the squeak of wheels on linoleum filtered through her partially open door. Curious, she reached for her walker and slowly made her way to investigate. "I don't need to be here," a gruff male voice insisted. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "Dad, please," a younger man pleaded. "It's just for a little while, until you're back on your feet." Mary peered around her door frame to see an elderly man in a wheelchair, his face a mask of indignation. A middle-aged man stood beside him, looking exhausted and frustrated. But it was the older man who caught Mary's attention. There was something hauntingly familiar about the set of his jaw, the arch of his eyebrows. As if sensing her gaze, the man in the wheelchair turned his head. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. Mary found herself staring into a pair of steel-gray eyes she thought she'd never see again. The novel slipped from Mary's suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud. The noise drew the attention of the men in the hallway, and as the older man's eyes widened in recognition, Mary felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Mary!" The name escaped his lips in a hoarse whisper. "Mary Sullivan?" Mary gripped her walker tightly, her knuckles turning white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. How was this possible? After all these years? "Do you two know each other?" the younger man asked, looking between them in confusion. Mary swallowed hard, her voice barely audible as she finally managed to speak. "John? John Miller? Is it really you?" As their eyes locked, 7 decades melted away in an instant. They were no longer two elderly strangers in a nursing home corridor. They were young lovers on a moonlit beach, with their whole lives stretching out before them like an endless horizon. Neither Mary nor John could have possibly imagined that this chance encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would unearth long-buried secrets, rekindle smoldering embers of the past, and force them to confront the consequences of choices made a lifetime ago. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the hallway in deepening shadows, one thing became crystal clear. Life at Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center would never be the same again. The following morning dawned bright and clear, but for Mary Anderson, it felt as though a fog had settled over Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center. She sat at her usual table in the dining room, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate, her mind a whirlwind of memories and questions. "Earth to Mary," chuckled her friend Doris, waving a wrinkled hand in front of Mary's face. "You haven't heard a word I've said, have you?" Mary blinked, forcing a smile. "I'm sorry, Doris. I didn't sleep well last night." Doris leaned in, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "It wouldn't have anything to do with that handsome new resident, would it? Word travels fast around here, you know." Mary felt heat rise to her cheeks. Even at 88, the thought of John Miller could make her blush like a schoolgirl. "It's complicated," she murmured. Before Doris could press further, a hush fell over the dining room. Mary looked up to see John being wheeled in by an orderly. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, the years fell away. She was 18 again, heart pounding as John approached her at the soda fountain. "Mind if I join you ladies?" John's gravelly voice broke the spell. Mary realized he was now beside their table, a hesitant smile on his lined face. "Please do," Doris said eagerly, shooting Mary a meaningful look. As John settled his wheelchair at their table, an awkward silence fell. Mary found herself studying his face, noting the changes time had wrought. The golden curls she'd once run her fingers through were now a sparse silver, and deep lines etched his once smooth skin. But his eyes, those steel-gray eyes, were exactly as she remembered. "So," John began, his voice gruff with emotion, "it's been a while, Mary." Mary let out a short, incredulous laugh. 70 years, John. It's been 70 years. Doris's eyes widened. 70 years? Oh my. This is better than my soaps. I'll just leave you two to catch up." She winked at Mary before tottering off with her walker, no doubt eager to spread the latest gossip. Alone at last, Mary and John regarded each other warily, like two boxers sizing each other up before a match. "You look good, Mary," John said softly. "Time's been kind to you." Mary snorted. "Flattery will get you nowhere, John Miller." Not anymore. But despite her words, she felt a familiar flutter in her chest. John's face fell. "I suppose I deserve that." "Mary, I don't." Mary cut him off, suddenly afraid of what he might say. "It was a lifetime ago. We were different people then." A flash of pain crossed John's features. "Were we? Sometimes I wonder." He trailed off, his gaze distant. Mary found herself reaching across the table, her hand hovering uncertainly before covering his gnarled fingers. The touch sent a jolt through her, awakening feelings she'd thought long dead. "John," she said quietly, "why are you here? Really?" He met her eyes, and the raw emotion she saw there took her breath away. "Would you believe me if I said it was fate?" Before Mary could respond, a commotion near the dining room entrance caught their attention. A striking middle-aged woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair strode in, her high heels clicking authoritatively on the linoleum floor. She made a beeline for their table, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "Dad!" she exclaimed, glaring at John. "What do you think you're doing? You're supposed to be resting." John's demeanor changed instantly, his shoulders tensing. "Elizabeth, I told you I'm fine. I was just catching up with an old friend." The woman, Elizabeth, turned her piercing gaze to Mary, who instinctively withdrew her hand from John's. "And who might you be?" Elizabeth asked, her tone icy. Mary straightened in her chair, meeting Elizabeth's stare head-on. "I'm Mary Anderson. John and I knew each other a long time ago." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Did you now?" How interesting that you never mentioned her, Dad. An uncomfortable silence descended on the table. Mary glanced at John, surprised to see a mix of guilt and defiance on his face. There's a lot I haven't told you, Elizabeth, John said quietly. But maybe it's time I did. Elizabeth opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the arrival of a distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit. I'm sorry I'm late, he said, slightly out of breath. Traffic was a nightmare. Mary felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized the man. It was Richard Thompson, her family's longtime lawyer. What on earth was he doing here? Richard's eyes widened as he took in the scene before him. Mary? I didn't expect to see you here. This complicates things. Complicates what? Mary and Elizabeth asked in unison, then glared at each other. John sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 90 years. I think it's time we all had a talk, he said. There are some things you both need to know. As Mary looked between John, Elizabeth, and Richard, she felt a sense of foreboding settle over her. Whatever John was about to reveal, she had a feeling it would change everything. The quiet life she'd carefully constructed over the past 7 decades was about to be turned upside down, all because of a chance encounter in a nursing home hallway. Little did she know, the revelations to come would shake the very foundations of her world, forcing her to confront long-buried truths and make choices that would impact not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. The tension in John's small room at Sunnyvale was palpable. Mary sat stiffly in an armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elizabeth paced near the window, her high heels clicking a nervous rhythm on the linoleum floor. Richard Thompson stood by the door, his briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield. And at the center of it all, John sat in his wheelchair, looking both determined and terrified. Before I begin, John said, his voice rough with emotion, I want you all to know that everything I did out of love. Elizabeth stopped pacing, fixing her father with a hard stare. What are you talking about, Dad? What have you done? John took a deep breath, then turned to Mary. Do you remember the summer of 1954? Mary? The promises we made. Mary felt her chest tighten. How could she forget? It was the summer that had defined her entire life. Of course I do, John, she whispered. Wait, Elizabeth interjected. You two were together? When? We were young and in love, John explained, a wistful smile touching his lips. I had just joined the Navy and Mary was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. Mary felt a blush creep up her cheeks, even as a familiar ache bloomed in her chest. John, please, that was a lifetime ago. No, John said firmly. It wasn't just a summer fling, Mary. What we had was real, and it never really ended. Elizabeth's eyes widened. What are you saying, Dad? John closed his eyes, steeling himself. I'm saying that I've been living a lie for the past 70 years, and it's time for the truth to come out. He nodded to Richard, who opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. These are DNA test results, Richard explained, his voice professional but tinged with unease, along with some other pertinent documents. Mary felt her world tilt. DNA test? John, what have you done? John reached out, grasping Mary's hand in his. The touch sent a jolt through her, just as it had all those years ago. Mary, do you remember the night before I shipped out? The night we... Mary's free hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. John, no, it can't be. Elizabeth snatched the folder from Richard, her eyes scanning the documents frantically. Her face paled. Dad, what is this? It says you're not my biological father. The room fell silent, the weight of John's revelation hanging heavy in the air. Mary felt as though she couldn't breathe. This couldn't be happening. Not after all these years. John squeezed Mary's hand, his eyes pleading. I found out a few months ago. I hired a private investigator. Mary, the baby you gave up for adoption. It was mine. Our daughter. She's here in this room. Elizabeth stumbled backwards, collapsing into a chair. This is insane. she muttered, her voice shaking. "I can't be. You're my father. Mom would have told me if—" "Your mother never knew," John said softly. "I never told her about Mary, about that summer. When we met, I was still heartbroken, still missing Mary every day. But I thought she had moved on, that she didn't want me anymore." Mary pulled her hand away from John's, anger suddenly flaring. "You thought I didn't want you? John Miller, I waited for you. I wrote you letters every day for months. But you never responded. Not once." John's brow furrowed in confusion. "Letters? Mary, I never received any letters from you. I thought you had chosen to give up our baby and forget about me." Mary shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I never forgot you, John. Not for a single day." Richard cleared his throat awkwardly. "If I may, there's more you both need to know." All eyes turned to the lawyer as he pulled out another document. This is a copy of Elizabeth's original birth certificate. It lists her biological mother as Mary Sullivan. Elizabeth's head snapped up, her gaze locking with Mary's. For a moment, neither woman spoke, the shock of the revelation rendering them speechless. "All this time," Elizabeth finally whispered, "I've had a mother I never knew about, a whole other life I could have had." Mary's heart broke at the pain in Elizabeth's voice. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to give you up, but I was young, alone. I thought I was doing what was best for you." John wheeled himself between the two women. "The blame is mine," he said firmly. "If I had known, if I had just talked to Mary, none of this would have happened. We could have been a family." The room fell silent again, each person lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the weight of the truths just revealed. Finally, Elizabeth stood, her legs shaky. "I need some air," she said, her voice hollow. I can't process this right now." Without another word, she fled the room, the door slamming behind her. Mary watched her go, her heart aching for the daughter she'd never known. She turned to John, a lifetime of questions in her eyes. "Why now, John? Why after all these years?" John's shoulders sagged. "I'm dying, Mary," he said quietly. "Cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. I couldn't leave this world without making things right, without giving Elizabeth the chance to know her real mother." Mary felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. John, dying? The man she'd loved for 70 years. The father of her child. How could the universe be so cruel as to bring him back into her life, only to snatch him away again? As the gravity of the situation settled over them, Mary realized that this was only the beginning. The revelations of the day had set in motion a chain of events that would force them all to confront painful truths, long-buried emotions, and the consequences of choices made a lifetime ago. In the quiet of John's room, with the Florida sun streaming through the windows, Mary Anderson faced the daunting reality that at 88 years old, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. And somewhere in Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center, a daughter she had never known was grappling with a truth that would reshape her entire identity. The stage was set for a journey of reconciliation, forgiveness, and perhaps, if they were lucky, a chance at the love and family they had been denied for so long. The following days at Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center were a blur of hushed whispers and furtive glances. News of John and Mary's reunion and the shocking revelations that followed spread through the facility like wildfire, turning their quiet twilight years into the subject of fevered gossip. Mary found herself alternating between numbness and overwhelming emotion. She'd sit for hours in the sunroom, staring out at the meticulously manicured gardens, trying to reconcile the life she'd lived with the life that could have been. It was on one such afternoon, exactly a week after the bombshell in John's room, that Elizabeth reappeared. Mary looked up from her crocheting to find her daughter, standing awkwardly at the entrance to the sunroom. "May I join you?" Elizabeth asked, her voice soft and uncertain. Mary nodded, her throat suddenly tight. As Elizabeth settled into the chair beside her, Mary noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. This revelation had shaken her to her core. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the gentle clicking of Mary's crochet needles and the distant chatter of birds outside. Finally, Elizabeth broke the silence. "I've been angry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "So angry, at Dad, at you, at the world. But mostly I've been angry at myself." Mary set her crocheting aside, turning to face Elizabeth fully. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, the endearment slipping out unbidden. "None of this is your fault." Elizabeth's eyes welled with tears. "Isn't it? I've spent my whole life feeling like something was missing, like I didn't quite fit. And now I know why. I had a mother out there, and I never even knew to look for you." Mary felt her own eyes fill with tears. Hesitantly, she reached out and took Elizabeth's hand. To her surprise and relief, Elizabeth didn't pull away. "I thought about you every day," Mary said softly. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone. I wondered where you were, what you were doing, if you were happy." Elizabeth squeezed Mary's hand. "I was happy. Dad, John, he's a good man. And my mom, well, the woman I thought was my mom. She loved me. But there was always something missing," Mary finished for her. Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, missing." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Then Elizabeth spoke again, her voice stronger. "Tell me about that summer, about you and Dad. I want to know. I want to know where I came from." Mary took a deep breath and began to speak. She told Elizabeth about the sunny days at the beach, the stolen kisses under the boardwalk, the promises whispered under starlit skies. She spoke of John's quick wit and kind heart, of the way he'd look at her like she was the only girl in the world. As she spoke, Mary felt years of pent-up emotion pouring out of her. She told Elizabeth about the day John shipped out, about the heart-wrenching moment she realized she was pregnant, about the agonizing decision to give her baby up for adoption. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Mary said, her voice choked with emotion. "I was young, alone. I wanted you to have the best life possible." Elizabeth listened intently, her eyes never leaving Mary's face. When Mary finished, Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," she finally said, "for telling me, for giving me life." Mary felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you for listening, for giving me a chance." Just then, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. They looked up to see John being wheeled towards them by a nurse, his face pale and drawn. "Dad!" Elizabeth exclaimed, rising to her feet. "What are you doing here? You should be resting." John waved off her concern. "I'm fine, Lizzie. I needed to see you both." As the nurse helped John position his wheelchair next to them, Mary couldn't help but notice how frail he looked. The revelation of his illness hit her anew, and she felt a fresh wave of grief wash over her. John looked between Mary and Elizabeth, a mix of hope and trepidation on his face. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No, we were just talking, getting to know each other." John's face lit up. "That's wonderful. I've been praying that you two might find a way to connect." Mary reached out and took John's hand, surprising herself with the gesture. "We're trying, John, one day at a time." As the three of them sat there, bathed in the warm afternoon sunlight, Mary felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could forge some kind of relationship out of this mess. Maybe it wasn't too late for the family they should have been. But even as that hope blossomed, Mary couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many potential pitfalls. And lurking beneath it all was the ticking clock of John's illness. As if reading her thoughts, John squeezed her hand. "We have a lot to talk about," he said softly. "All of us. There's still so much you both need to know." Elizabeth tensed visibly. "More secrets, Dad?" John sighed heavily. "Not secrets exactly, but consequences. Choices I made that affected both of you in ways I'm only now beginning to understand." Mary felt a chill run down her spine. What more could there possibly be? As she looked between John and Elizabeth, she realized that their journey was far from over. The revelations of the past week were just the beginning. In that moment, surrounded by the two people who should have been her family all along, Mary Anderson steeled herself for whatever was to come. Because no matter what John was about to reveal, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was determined to face them head-on. After 70 years of separation and secrets, they had been given a second chance. And Mary was not about to let it slip away without a fight. The following morning found Mary, John, and Elizabeth gathered in a private meeting room at Sunnyvale. The atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. John sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, while Mary and Elizabeth flanked him on either side. "Before I begin," John said, his voice gravelly with emotion, "I want you both to know that everything I did out of love. Misguided love, perhaps, but love nonetheless." Mary reached out and squeezed his hand. "We're listening, John." John took a deep breath and began his tale. "After I shipped out that summer, I was heartbroken. I wrote to you every day, Mary, but I never got a response. I thought you'd moved on." Mary's brow furrowed. "But I wrote to you too, John. Every single day." John nodded sadly. "I know that now, but back then, well, that's where things get complicated." He paused, steeling himself. "My best friend in the Navy was a guy named Frank Thompson. He was from our hometown, and I trusted him implicitly." At the mention of Frank's name, Mary gasped. "Frank? But he told me you'd met someone else, that you didn't want to hear from me anymore." John's face darkened. "Frank betrayed us both, Mary. He intercepted our letters. He was in love with you, had been for years. He saw an opportunity and he took it." Elizabeth, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Wait, Frank Thompson? As in Richard Thompson's father? Our family lawyer?" John nodded grimly. "The very same. Frank's deception ran deep, and its consequences have echoed through generations." Mary felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. "But why? Why would he do such a thing?" "Because he thought he could win your heart if I was out of the picture," John explained, his voice heavy with regret. "And in a way, he succeeded. He was there for you when you gave up our baby, wasn't he?" Mary nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "He was. He arranged the adoption, made sure everything was legal and above board. Or so I thought." John reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. "This is why I asked Richard to be here the other day. He found this in his father's old files. It's not easy to read." Elizabeth took the paper with trembling hands and began to read aloud. As she did, her voice grew increasingly distressed. "This document states that the adoption was never officially finalized. That Frank Thompson falsified records to make it appear legal, but in reality, John finished for her, Elizabeth was never legally adopted. Technically, legally, she's still our daughter, Mary." The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over them. Mary felt as though she might faint. All these years, all the pain and heartache of giving up her child, and it had all been based on a lie? Elizabeth broke the silence, her voice shaking. "So what does this mean? Legally, ethically? Who am I?" John reached out and took her hand. "You're our daughter, Elizabeth. You always have been. But you're also the daughter of the people who raised you and loved you. This doesn't change that." Mary found her voice at last. "But it changes everything else, doesn't it? All these years, all the secrets and lies. How do we even begin to unravel this mess?" John's expression was pained. "That's why I needed to tell you both now. With my illness, I don't have much time left. But I want to make things right. I want us to be a family, whatever that might look like." Elizabeth stood abruptly, pacing the room. This is too much. I need time to process this. My whole life, my entire identity, it's all built on lies." Mary's heart ached for her daughter. She wanted nothing more than to wrap her arms around Elizabeth, to comfort her, but she knew it was too soon. Instead, she turned to John. "What do you propose we do now?" John's eyes were filled with determination. "I want to set things right legally and morally. I want to acknowledge Elizabeth as our daughter, to make sure she's provided for in my will. But more than that, I want us to have the time we were robbed of, however much of it I have left." As John spoke, Mary felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Anger at Frank's betrayal, grief for the years lost, hope for the future, and fear of losing John all over again. But beneath it all was a fierce love for the man she'd never stopped loving, and for the daughter she'd never truly known. Elizabeth stopped pacing and turned to face them, her expression a complex mix of emotions. I need some time. This is a lot to take in. But I don't want to waste whatever time we have left, either." Mary stood and cautiously approached her daughter. "We'll take it one day at a time, sweetheart. There's no rule book for this kind of situation. We'll figure it out together." As Elizabeth nodded, accepting Mary's tentative hug, John watched them with tears in his eyes. The family he'd always dreamed of was finally within reach, but the specter of his illness loomed large. In that moment, as the three of them stood united for the first time, they knew that the road ahead would be challenging. There would be legal battles to face, emotional hurdles to overcome, and a lifetime of missed moments to reconcile. But they also knew that they had been given a precious second chance. And as the Florida sun streamed through the windows of Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center, Mary, John, and Elizabeth silently vowed to make every moment count. Little did they know that fate had one more surprise in store for them, a twist that would test their newfound bond and force them to confront the true meaning of family, forgiveness, and love. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and activity at Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center. Mary, John, and Elizabeth fell into a tentative routine of daily visits, each interaction a delicate dance of getting to know one another while navigating the complex emotions their situations stirred up. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, Mary sat with John in the facility's garden, their hands intertwined as they watched a pair of cardinals flit between the bushes. The peacefulness of the moment was shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. "Mom! Dad!" Elizabeth called out, her voice tinged with excitement and a hint of trepidation. Both Mary and John still felt a thrill at hearing Elizabeth address them that way, even after weeks of cautious bonding. Elizabeth reached them, slightly out of breath, clutching a manila envelope. "I've been doing some digging," she said, her eyes bright with determination. "About the adoption, about Frank Thompson's involvement. And I found something unexpected." John leaned forward in his wheelchair, his brow furrowed with concern. "What is it, Lizzie?" Elizabeth took a deep breath before continuing. "I hired a private investigator to look into Frank's past, and it turns out I wasn't the only baby he helped adopt under questionable circumstances." Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You mean there are others?" Elizabeth nodded grimly. "At least 3 that we know of, all within a 5-year period. And one of them," she paused, swallowing hard, "one of them was adopted by Frank himself." John's face paled. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I think," Elizabeth said slowly, "that Richard Thompson might be my half-brother." "Our half-brother?" she amended, glancing between Mary and John. The revelation hung heavy in the air. Mary felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet once again. "But how? Why?" Elizabeth sank onto the bench beside Mary. From what the investigator could piece together, Frank was desperate for a child of his own. His wife couldn't conceive, and he took advantage of his position to essentially steal a baby. My brother." John's expression hardened. "That bastard," he muttered. Not content with ruining our lives, he had to ruin others too. Mary reached out and took Elizabeth's hand. "Does Richard know?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I don't think so, but I think we need to tell him. He deserves to know the truth about his father, and about his own origins." As if on cue, they spotted Richard Thompson himself walking briskly towards them across the lawn. His usual polished demeanor seemed ruffled, and he clutched a folder tightly to his chest. "I'm glad I found you all together," Richard said as he reached them, his voice strained. "There's something I need to discuss with you. Something troubling." The three exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever Richard was about to reveal, it was clear their worlds were about to be shaken once more. Richard took a seat on a nearby bench, his professional facade cracking slightly. "I've been going through my father's old files, trying to understand the full extent of his actions regarding Elizabeth's adoption. And I found something that I think you all need to see." He opened the folder and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "This was hidden in a false bottom of my father's desk. It's a letter from you, Mary, to John, dated just a few weeks after Elizabeth was born." Mary's heart began to race. "But that's impossible. I never sent any letters after Frank told me John had moved on." Richard nodded grimly. "It seems my father intercepted this one as well, but for some reason he kept it. And its contents, well, they change everything." With trembling hands, Richard handed the letter to John. As John began to read aloud, his voice thick with emotion, Mary felt as though she were being transported back in time. "My dearest John, I know you've asked me not to write that you found someone new, but I can't let you go without telling you the truth. We have a daughter, John, a beautiful baby girl with your eyes and my smile. I named her Elizabeth after your grandmother. I know you've moved on, and I respect your choice, but I couldn't bear the thought of you never knowing about our child. Whatever you decide, know that I will always love you both. Forever yours, Mary." As John finished reading, a heavy silence fell over the group. Mary felt tears streaming down her cheeks, the memories of writing that letter flooding back to her. Elizabeth was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, you both thought the other had abandoned you, but it was all because of Frank's lies." John reached out, grasping Mary's hand tightly. "If I had known, God, Mary, if I had only known, I would have come back in a heartbeat." Richard cleared his throat awkwardly. "There's more. My father, he left a confession, a detailed account of everything he did, everyone he hurt, including me." As Richard's words sank in, the full weight of Frank Thompson's deception became clear. He had manipulated lives, torn families apart, all in pursuit of his own selfish desires. Mary looked around at the faces of her newfound family, John, the love she'd never truly lost, Elizabeth, the daughter she'd mourned for decades, and now Richard, an unexpected addition to their complex web of relationships. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the garden and the ugliness of the truths they'd uncovered, Mary realized that their journey was far from over. There were still wounds to heal, truths to confront, and a family to rebuild. But as she squeezed John's hand and met Elizabeth's tear-filled gaze, Mary felt a surge of determination. They had been given a second chance, a chance to right the wrongs of the past and forge a new future together. As the Florida sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, the four of them sat in contemplative silence. They knew that the days ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and emotional reckonings. But they also knew that they would face those challenges together, as the family they were always meant to be. Little did they know that fate had one final twist in store, a revelation that would test the limits of their newfound bond and force them to redefine the very meaning of family. The revelation of Frank Thompson's extensive deceptions had left the newly formed family reeling. For days, Mary, John, Elizabeth, and Richard found themselves grappling with the implications of their shared history. The quiet halls of Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center became a crucible for their emotions, as they struggled to reconcile the past with their present reality. On a particularly humid Florida morning, the four of them gathered in John's room. The air conditioner hummed softly in the background, a counterpoint to the tension that filled the space. "I've been thinking," John began, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "about everything that's happened, about the time we've lost, and the time we have left." Mary reached out and took his hand, a gesture that had become second nature over the past weeks. "What's on your mind, John?" John's eyes, still as piercing as they had been in his youth, scanned the faces of his family. I want to make things right, legally, morally, in every way possible. I want to acknowledge Elizabeth as our daughter, Mary. And Richard. He paused, looking at the man who had been as much a victim of Frank's machinations as the rest of them. I want to help you find your birth parents, if that's what you want. Richard, who had been standing by the window, turned to face them. His usual composed demeanor was cracked, revealing the vulnerability beneath. I don't know what I want, he admitted. My whole life has been a lie. The man I thought was my father. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Elizabeth stood and approached Richard, placing a comforting hand on his arm. We're in this together, she said softly. Whatever you decide, we'll support you. Mary felt a surge of pride at her daughter's compassion. Despite the shock and pain of their situation, Elizabeth had shown a strength of character that amazed her. There's something else, John continued, his voice taking on a note of urgency. I've spoken with my doctors. The treatments, they're not working as well as we'd hoped. I may have less time than we thought. The room fell silent, the weight of John's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Mary felt her heart constrict, the fear of losing John again, this time permanently, threatening to overwhelm her. What are you saying, Dad? Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling slightly. John's face softened as he looked at his daughter. I'm saying that I don't want to waste any more time. I want us to be a family in every sense of the word. I want to make up for all the years we've lost. He turned to Mary, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. Mary, I know it's been 70 years, and we're not the same people we were back then, but my feelings for you have never changed. Will you marry me? Again? Mary gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. For a moment, she was transported back to that summer night on the beach, when a young John Miller had first asked her to be his wife. Oh, John, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. As John and Mary embraced, Elizabeth and Richard exchanged glances, a mix of emotions playing across their faces. Joy for the reunited couple, sadness for the years lost, and a tentative hope for the future. We could have the ceremony right here at Sunnyvale, Elizabeth suggested, her voice thick with emotion. Something small, intimate, just family. John nodded, his eyes never leaving Mary's face. That sounds perfect, but there's one more thing I want to do first. He turned to Richard, his expression serious. Richard, I know you're still processing everything, but I want you to know that regardless of blood, you're a part of this family now. If you'll have us. Richard stood still for a moment, visibly struggling with his emotions. Then slowly he nodded. I think I'd like that, he said quietly. As the four of them came together in a group embrace, Mary felt a sense of completeness she hadn't experienced in decades. They were an unconventional family, bound together by secrets and lies, but also by love and forgiveness. But even as they celebrated this moment of unity, a shadow loomed on the horizon. John's deteriorating health was a stark reminder that their time together was limited. And unbeknownst to them, there was one final secret yet to be revealed, a truth that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their shared history. As they began to plan for John and Mary's wedding, none of them could have predicted the storm that was about to break over their newly formed family. A storm that would test the strength of their bonds and force them to confront the true meaning of love, loyalty, and redemption. In the quiet of John's room at Sunnyvale, surrounded by the people he loved most in the world, John Miller closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer. Not for more time he knew that was beyond his reach, but for the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead, and to leave this world knowing he had finally made things right. Little did he know that fate had one last twist in store, a revelation that would shake the very foundations of the family they had fought so hard to build. The days leading up to John and Mary's wedding were a flurry of activity at Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center. Despite the staff's initial skepticism, they had embraced the idea of hosting the ceremony, touched by the couple's enduring love story. Elizabeth had thrown herself into the planning, determined to give her parents the celebration they had been denied decades ago. Richard, still grappling with his own identity crisis, found solace in helping with the preparations. On the eve of the wedding, Mary sat in her room, running her fingers over the simple white dress Elizabeth had helped her choose. A soft knock at the door roused her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Elizabeth or one of the nurses. Instead, it was Richard who entered, his face drawn with worry. "Mary, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's something you need to see." He held out a weathered envelope, his hand trembling slightly. "I found this while going through the last of my father's things. It's addressed to you, from John." Mary's heart raced as she took the envelope. The postmark dated it to just weeks after John had shipped out that fateful summer. With shaking hands, she opened it and began to read. "My dearest Mary, I hope this letter finds you well. I know we agreed to wait until I returned to get married, but I can't bear the thought of another day passing without you as my wife. I've enclosed a letter for your father, asking for his blessing. If he agrees, I want us to be married by proxy. It's not ideal, but it would mean that when I return, we can start our life together immediately. I love you more than I ever thought possible. Please say you'll be my wife. Forever yours, John." Mary felt the room spin around her. But I never received this letter. Frank must have intercepted it too." Richard nodded grimly. "There's more. I found records indicating that my father, that Frank, he went through with the proxy marriage. On paper, you and John have been legally married for the past 70 years. The revelation hit Mary like a physical blow. All these years, all the pain and loneliness, and they had been husband and wife all along. "Does John know?" she whispered. Richard shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first. Mary, I'm so sorry for everything my father did. The lives he ruined." Mary reached out and took Richard's hand. "You're not responsible for his actions, Richard. You're as much a victim in this as any of us." Just then, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Elizabeth who entered, her face flushed with excitement. "Mom, I just wanted to check if you need. What's wrong?" Mary and Richard exchanged glances before Mary patted the bed beside her. "Sit down, sweetheart. There's something we need to tell you." As Mary recounted the latest revelation, Elizabeth's expression cycled through shock, anger, and finally, a determined resolve. "We have to tell Dad," she said firmly. "He deserves to know the truth before tomorrow's ceremony." Mary nodded, her heart heavy. "You're right, but how will he react? After everything we've been through?" "Together," Elizabeth said, taking her mother's hand. "We'll tell him together." The three of them made their way to John's room, each lost in their own thoughts. As they entered, they found John sitting by the window, gazing out at the setting sun. "John," Mary said softly, her voice catching, "there's something we need to talk about." As they shared the contents of the letter and the truth about the proxy marriage, John's face went through a myriad of emotions. Shock, anger, grief, and finally a deep, profound sadness. "All these years," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "We've been married all this time. Mary, can you ever forgive me for not fighting harder to find you?" Mary rushed to his side, taking his face in her hands. "Oh, John, there's nothing to forgive. We were both victims of Frank's deception, but we're here now together. That's all that matters." As the four of them huddled together, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air, they realized that tomorrow's ceremony had taken on a new significance. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a renewal of vows, a reaffirmation of a love that had endured despite decades of separation and lies. But even as they found solace in each other's arms, none of them could have predicted the final twist that fate had in store. For lurking in the shadows of their past was one last secret, a truth so shocking that it would challenge everything they thought they knew about their family and test the limits of their newfound bond. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across John's room, the Miller-Thompson family held each other close, drawing strength from their unity. They had weathered so many storms already, Surely they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did they know that the greatest test of their love and loyalty was yet to come. The morning of John and Mary's wedding dawned bright and clear, the Florida sun casting a warm glow over Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center. Despite the emotional turbulence of the previous evening, there was an air of excitement and anticipation throughout the facility. Mary stood in front of the mirror in her room, Elizabeth helping her with the final touches of her simple yet elegant outfit. The knowledge that she and John had been legally married for 7 decades added a bittersweet poignancy to the day. "You look beautiful, Mom," Elizabeth said softly, adjusting Mary's corsage. Mary smiled at her daughter through the mirror. "Thank you, sweetheart, for everything." A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Richard poked his head in, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here you need to see." Both of you, exchanging worried glances, Mary and Elizabeth followed Richard to the small conference room that had been set aside for the wedding party. As they entered, they saw John sitting in his wheelchair, looking as confused as they felt. But it was the stranger standing by the window that caught their attention. The man turned as they entered, and Mary felt her breath catch in her throat. He was in his early 70s, with John's strong jawline and her own blue eyes. "Hello," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "My name is Thomas Sullivan, and I think I might be your son." The room fell silent, the weight of this new revelation hanging heavy in the air. Mary felt her knees go weak, and Elizabeth quickly guided her to a chair. John was the first to find his voice. "But how is this possible? We only had one child." Thomas took a deep breath before explaining. "I was born 9 months after you shipped out, John. Mary, you were told I was stillborn. But the truth is, I was taken and given up for adoption by Frank Thompson." The pieces started falling into place. Mary's mind raced back to that terrible day when she'd been told her baby boy hadn't survived. The grief, the pain, and Frank's comforting presence through it all. "He told me it would be easier this way," Thomas continued. "That with one baby already given up for adoption, it would be kinder to let you believe I hadn't survived. He arranged for my adoption himself." Elizabeth, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. "So you're my brother?" "My twin brother." Thomas nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I only found out recently. When the news of your reunion hit the local papers, I started digging. I found the records of my birth and adoption. And then I found Richard's investigation into Frank's activities." Richard, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. If I had known." John held up a hand, silencing him. "This isn't your fault, Richard. None of us could have imagined the extent of Frank's deceptions." Mary stood on shaky legs and approached Thomas. She reached out a trembling hand to touch his face, tracing the familiar lines of John's features mixed with her own. "My son," she whispered. "My beautiful boy." As mother and son embraced for the first time in over 7 decades, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. John wheeled himself over, enveloping both Mary and Thomas in his arms. Elizabeth joined the embrace, and after a moment's hesitation, so did Richard. They stood like that for several minutes, this improbable family brought together by love, torn apart by deceit, and reunited by fate. As they slowly separated, each wiping away tears, John cleared his throat. "Well," he said, a hint of his old mischievous smile playing on his lips, "I'd say this calls for a celebration, and as it happens, we have a wedding all set up and ready to go. What do you say we make it a family reunion as well?" Mary laughed through her tears, the joy of finding her son tempered by the bittersweet knowledge of all the years they'd lost. "I think that sounds perfect." As they made their way to the facility's garden where the ceremony was to be held, Mary felt a sense of completeness she'd never known before. Her family, broken, pieced back together, and now expanded in ways she could never have imagined, was finally whole. The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike any Sunnyvale had ever seen. It was a celebration of enduring love, of family found and reunited, and of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable challenges. As John and Mary renewed their vows, surrounded by their children and the family they'd forged through shared experiences, they knew that whatever time they had left together would be filled with love, laughter, and the joy of newfound connections. And as the Florida sun began to set on this most extraordinary of days, casting a golden glow over the assembled family, they all silently vowed to make every moment count. For they had been given a precious gift, a second chance at the family they should have been all along. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still wounds to heal, relationships to build, and a lifetime of missed moments to reconcile. But together, they knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. For in the end, it was love that had brought them together, and it was love that would see them through. In the weeks following the wedding and the revelation of Thomas's existence, the newly expanded Miller-Thompson family found themselves navigating uncharted emotional territory. Sunnyvale Assisted Living Center became the unlikely backdrop for their attempts to forge connections and bridge the gaps left by decades of separation. On a mild autumn morning, Mary sat in the facility's sunroom, surrounded by her children. Elizabeth and Thomas sat side by side on a small sofa, their physical similarities now strikingly apparent. Richard occupied an armchair nearby, still somewhat unsure of his place in this unconventional family unit. John wheeled himself into the room, his face lighting up at the sight of his assembled family. Despite the toll his illness had taken, there was a new vitality in his eyes. "Well, isn't this a sight for sore eyes?" he said, his voice warm with affection. Mary reached out and took his hand as he positioned himself next to her. "We were just talking about Thanksgiving," she explained. "It'll be our first holiday together as a family." Thomas nodded, a hint of nervousness in his smile. "I was thinking, if it's all right with everyone, I'd like to invite my adoptive parents. They've been so supportive through all of this, and I'd love for them to meet you all." There was a moment of silence as everyone processed this suggestion. It was Elizabeth who spoke first, reaching out to squeeze her twin's hand. "I think that's a wonderful idea. They're part of our family too, in a way." John nodded in agreement. "Absolutely, the more the merrier. And speaking of family..." He turned to Richard, who had been quietly observing the interaction. "Richard, I hope you'll join us too. Regardless of blood, you're as much a part of this family as anyone." Richard's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with emotion. I'd be honored," he said softly. As they continued to plan for the upcoming holiday, Mary found herself marveling at the scene before her. If someone had told her a year ago that she'd be sitting here, surrounded by her children and the love of her life, planning a family Thanksgiving, she would have thought them mad. Yet here they were, defying all odds. The conversation flowed freely, punctuated by laughter and the occasional tear as they shared stories and began the process of knitting their separate lives into a shared history. Thomas regaled them with tales of his adoptive family and his career as a high school teacher. Elizabeth spoke of her own children and grandchildren, promising to bring them for a visit soon. As the morning wore on, Mary noticed John growing tired, though he tried to hide it. She caught Elizabeth's eye, and her daughter smoothly suggested they break for lunch. As the others filed out of the room, Mary held John back for a moment. "Are you all right, love?" she asked softly, concern etching her features. John smiled, reaching up to cup her cheek. "I'm more than all right, Mary. I'm happier than I've been in 70 years. Seeing our family together like this, it's more than I ever dared hope for." Mary leaned into his touch, her heart swelling with love and a tinge of bittersweet sadness. She knew their time together was limited, but she was determined to make every moment count. "Come on," she said, standing and taking the handles of his wheelchair. "Let's go join our children for lunch." As they made their way to the dining room, Mary couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. They had overcome so much to get to this point, but she knew there were still challenges ahead. Building relationships, healing old wounds, and making up for lost time wouldn't be easy. But as she looked at John, and then at the children waiting for them at the table, she felt a surge of determination. They were a family now, bound by love, forgiveness, and a shared desire to make the most of the time they had left together. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. And in that knowledge, Mary found a peace she hadn't known in decades. Little did they know that fate had one final surprise in store for the Miller-Thompson family, a twist that would bring their journey full circle and test the strength of their newfound bonds in ways they could never have imagined. As Thanksgiving approached, the Miller-Thompson family found themselves caught up in a whirlwind of preparations. The administration at Sunnyvale had graciously offered the use of their largest community room for the occasion, recognizing the special circumstances of this extraordinary family reunion. On the morning of Thanksgiving, Mary woke early, her heart full of anticipation and a touch of nervousness. As she helped John get ready for the day, she couldn't help but notice how frail he had become in recent weeks. Still, there was a light in his eyes that hadn't dimmed. "Happy Thanksgiving, my love," John said, reaching for her hand. "Can you believe we're finally here, after all these years?" Mary leaned down to kiss him softly. "It feels like a dream, John, a beautiful, impossible dream." As the morning progressed, family members began to arrive. Elizabeth came with her husband, children, and grandchildren in tow. Thomas arrived with his adoptive parents, their initial awkwardness quickly dissolving in the warm atmosphere. Richard was the last to arrive, carrying a bouquet of flowers for Mary and a bottle of John's favorite whiskey. The community room buzzed with activity and conversation. Children darted between adults, marveling at the sudden expansion of their family tree. Mary found herself at the center of it all, alternating between joyous laughter and tears of happiness as she watched her family come together. As they gathered around the table, John cleared his throat, calling for attention. "Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the faces of his loved ones. "A year ago, I was alone, thinking my life was coming to a quiet end. Now, I'm surrounded by more love and family than I ever dreamed possible. Whatever time I have left, I'm grateful to spend it with all of you." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as John finished speaking. Mary squeezed his hand, too overwhelmed for words. As the meal progressed, stories were shared, connections were forged, and the bonds of family grew stronger. Mary watched in wonder as Elizabeth and Thomas fell easily into the rapport of siblings who had known each other all their lives. She saw Richard relax, finally accepting his place in this unconventional family. Midway through the meal, Thomas stood up, a nervous smile on his face. "I have an announcement to make," he said. "In going through some old papers, I found something I think belongs to you, Mom and Dad." He pulled out an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Mary. With trembling hands, she opened it to find a faded photograph. It was of her and John, young and in love, standing on the beach where they had first met. "I thought this was lost forever," Mary whispered, tears flowing freely now. John leaned in to look, his eyes misting over. "I remember that day like it was yesterday," he said softly. As the photograph was passed around the table, Mary felt a sense of completion wash over her. This picture, lost for so many years, had found its way back to them, just as they had found their way back to each other. The day wore on, filled with laughter, tears, and the creation of new memories. As evening fell and family members began to depart, Mary and John found themselves alone in the community room, surrounded by the remnants of their Thanksgiving feast. "What are you thinking, my love?" John asked, noticing Mary's contemplative expression. Mary smiled, taking his hand in hers. "I'm thinking about how lucky we are, John. Despite everything, despite all the years lost, we're here, together, with our family." John nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "We've come full circle, Mary, from that beach 70 years ago to this moment now. It hasn't been the life we planned, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." As they sat there, hand in hand, Mary realized that this was the happy ending she had always dreamed of, even if it had come later in life than she had expected. They had faced unimaginable challenges, endured decades of separation, and emerged stronger for it all. Their story was one of love lost and found, of family torn apart and reunited, of secrets revealed and forgiveness granted. It was a testament to the enduring power of love and the unbreakable bonds of family. As the last rays of the setting sun filtered through the windows, painting the room in a warm, golden glow, Mary and John shared a tender kiss. In that moment, they knew that whatever time they had left together would be filled with love, laughter, and the joy of family. Their journey had indeed come full circle, and though the road had been long and winding, they had finally found their way home. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.